Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Today we are looking at chapter 8, The Last Night, but the second half. If you haven't already watched the first half, pause me, go back to the playlists and find that first section. We've read about 5 pages already, but because it's quite a large chapter, I thought I'd split up over 2 videos. As always, I will read along to you, pause every now and then, just briefly to make sure everyone's happy with what's going on. But for now, let's get cracking. The last thing that we read, Mr. Utterson was talking with Poole outside the cabinet door, explaining his idea or interpretation of the strange events, thinking that perhaps Dr. Jekyll was deeply unwell and he needed those drugs to help with his symptoms, and the strange voice and the strange behaviour was all part of some horrible illness. And this is what Poole says. "Sir," said the butler, turning to a sort of mottled pallor, "that thing was not my master, and there's the truth. My master," here he looked round and began to whisper, "is a tall, fine build of a man, and this was more of a dwarf." Utterson attempted to protest. "Oh, sir," cried Poole, "do you think I do not know my master after 20 years? Do you think I do not know where his head comes to in the cabinet door, where I saw him every morning of my life? No, sir, that thing in the mask was never Dr. Jekyll. God knows what it was, but it was never Dr. Jekyll, and it is the belief of my heart that there was murder done." "Poole," replied the lawyer, "if you say that, it will become my duty to make certain. Much as I desire to spare your master's feelings, much as I am puzzled about this note, which seems to prove him to still be alive, I shall consider it my duty to break in that door." "Ah, Mr. Utterson, that's talking," cried the butler. "And now comes the second question," resumed Utterson. "Who is going to do it?" "Why, you and me, sir," was the undaunted reply. "That is very well said," returned the lawyer, "and whatever comes of it, I shall make it my business to see you are no loser. Because, of course, remember that if Dr. Jekyll is alive and well, and his butler has just gone and got his friend to break down his door, that's see you later, butler." So Utterson's saying, "Don't worry, I'll look after you. I'll make sure that you're fine, no matter what happens." "Okay. There is an axe in the theatre," continued Poole, "and you might take the kitchen poker for yourself." The lawyer took that rude but weighty instrument into his hand and balanced it. "Do you know, Poole," he said, looking up, "that you and I are about to place ourselves in a position of some peril?" "You may say so indeed, sir," returned the butler. "It is well then that we should be frank," said the other. "We both think more than we have said. Let us make a clean breast. This masked figure that you saw, did you recognise it?" "Well, sir, it went so quick, and the creature was so doubled up that I could hardly swear to that," was the answer. "But if you mean, was it Mr. Hyde?" "Why, yes, I think it was. You see, it was much of the same bigness, and it had that same quick, light way with it. And then, who else could have got in by the laboratory door? You have not forgot, sir, that at the time of the murder, he still had the key with him. But that's not all. I don't know, Mr. Utterson, if ever you met this Mr. Hyde." "Yes," said the lawyer. "I once spoke with him." "Then you must know, as well as the rest of us, that there was something queer about that gentleman, something that gave a man a turn. I don't know rightly how to say it, sir, beyond this, that you felt it in your marrow, kind of cold and thin." "I own I felt something of what you describe," said Mr. Utterson. "Quite so," returned Poole. "Well, when that masked thing like a monkey jumped from among the chemicals and whipped into the cabinet, it went down my spine like ice. Oh, I know it's not evidence, Mr. Utterson. I'm book-learned enough for that. But a man has his feelings, and I give you my Bible word, it was Mr. Hyde." "Aye, aye," said the lawyer. "My fears incline to the same point. Evil, I fear, founded, evil was sure to come of that connection. Aye, truly, I believe you. I believe poor Harry is killed, and I believe his murderer, for what purpose God can tell, is still lurking in his victim's room. Well, let our name be vengeance. Call Bradshaw." The footman came at the summons, very white and nervous. "Pull yourself together, Bradshaw," said the lawyer. "This suspense I know is telling upon all of you, but it is now our intention to make an end of it. Poole here and I are going to force our way into the cabinet. If all is well, my shoulders are broad enough to take the blame." Meanwhile, lest anything should really be amiss, or any malefactor seek to escape by the back, you and the boy must go round the corner with a pair of good sticks and take your post at the laboratory door. We give you 10 minutes to get to your stations." As Bradshaw left, the lawyer looked at his watch. "And now, Paul, let us get to ours," he said, and taking the poker under his arm, he led the way into the yard. The scud had banked over the moon, and it was now quite dark. The wind, which only broke in puffs and draughts into that deep well of building, tossed the light of the candle to and fro about their steps until they came into the shelter of the theatre, where they sat down silently to wait. London hummed solemnly all around, but nearer at hand, the stillness was only broken by the sound of a footfall moving to and fro along the cabinet floor. "So it will walk all day, sir," whispered Paul. "Aye, in the better part of the night. Only when a new sample comes from the chemist there's a bit of a break. Ah, it's an ill conscience that such an enemy to rest. Ah, sir, there's blood foully shed in every step of it. But hark again, a little closer. Put your heart in your ears, Mr. Utterson, and tell me, is that the doctor's foot? Is that the doctor's foot?" The steps fell lightly and oddly, with a certain swing, for all they went so slowly. It was different indeed from the heavy, creaking tread of Henry Jekyll. Utterson sighed. "Is there never anything else?" he asked. Paul nodded. "Once," he said. "Once I heard it weeping." "Weeping? How that?" said the lawyer, conscious of a sudden chill of horror. "Weeping like a woman, or a lost soul," said the butler. "I came away with that upon my heart that I could have wept too." But now the 10 minutes drew to an end. Paul disinterred the axe from under a stack of packing straw. The candle was set upon the nearest table to light them to the attack, and they drew near with bated breath to where that patient foot was still going up and down in the quiet of the night. So this is so strange. So what they believe is that Dr. Jekyll has been murdered or taken away, and they believe the murderer or the criminal, who they are fairly convinced is Mr. Hyde, is in there. And Paul is saying all of this walking backwards and forwards, this pacing up and down, which we know is normally a sign of stress or anxiety, is happening all the time. But it's not just that. He's been crying. So this doesn't sound like the cold, sneering Hyde that, has been remorseless in the face of his crimes. So more mystery being built up here. So let's keep going. "Jekyll," cried Utterson with a loud voice, "I demand to see you." He paused a moment, but there came no reply. "I give you fair warning. Our suspicions are aroused, and I must and shall see you," he resumed. "If not by fair means, then by foul. If not of your consent, then by brute force." "Utterson," said the voice, "for God's sake, have mercy." "Ah, that's not Jekyll's voice. It's Hyde's," cried Utterson. "Down with the door, Paul." Paul swung the axe over his shoulder. The blow shook the building, and the red baize door leapt against the lock and hinges. A dismal screech, as of mere animal terror, rang from the cabinet. Up went the axe again, and again the panels crashed and the frame bounded. 4 times the blow fell, but the wood was tough and the fittings were of excellent workmanship, and it was not until the 5th that the lock burst in sunder and the wreck of the door fell inwards on the carpet. The besiegers, appalled by their own riot and the stillness that had succeeded, stood back a little and peered in. There lay the cabinet before their eyes in the quiet lamplight, a good fire glowing and chattering on the hearth, the kettle singing its thin strain, a drawer or two open, papers neatly set forth on the business table, and nearer the fire the things laid out for tea, the quietest room, you would have said, and, but for the glazed presses full of chemicals, the most commonplace that night in London. Right in the midst there lay the body of a man, sorely contorted and still twitching. They drew near on tiptoe, turned it on its back, and beheld the face of Edward Hyde. He was dressed in clothes far too large for him, clothes of the doctor's bigness. The cords of his face still moved with a semblance of life, but life was quite gone, and by the crushed phial in the hand and the strong smell of kernels that hung upon the air, Utterson knew that he was looking on the body of a self-destroyer. So Mr. Hyde has committed suicide. In that instant, I mean, he's sort of still twitching on the floor as they stand there, like he's obviously just taken a poison as they were banging down the door, crashing down that door. Mysteries. "We have come too late," he said sternly, "whether to save or punish. Hyde is gone to his account. It only remains for us to find the body of your master." The far greater proportion of the building was occupied by the theatre, which filled almost the whole ground story and was lighted from above, and by the cabinet, which formed an upper story at one end and looked upon the court. A corridor joined the theatre to the door on the by-street, and with this the cabinet communicated separately by a second flight of stairs. There were besides a few dark closets and a spacious cellar. All these they now thoroughly examined. Each closet needed but a glance, for all were empty, and all, by the dust that fell from their doors, had stood long unopened. The cellar, indeed, was filled with crazy lumber, mostly dating from the times of the surgeon who was Dr. Jekyll's predecessor. But even as they opened the door, they were advertised of the uselessness of further search by the fall of a perfect mat of cobweb which had for years sealed up the entrance. Nowhere was there any trace of Henry Jekyll, dead or alive. Poole stamped on the flags of the corridor. "He must be buried here," he said, hearkening to the sound. "Or he may have fled," said Utterson, and he turned to examine the door in the by-street. It was locked, and lying nearby on the flags, they found the key already stained with rust. "This does not look like use," observed the lawyer. "Use?" echoed Poole. "Do you not see, sir? It is broken, much as if a man had stamped on it." "Ah," continued Utterson, "and the fractures, too, are rusty." The two men looked at each other with a scare. "This is beyond me, Poole," said the lawyer. "Let us go back to the cabinet. They're confused here, of course, because they're like, oh, well, maybe he just ran, but the door's locked and the key's broken, so he wouldn't have been able to run out either. So very confusing." They mounted the stair in silence, and still with an occasional awestruck glance at the dead body, proceeded more thoroughly to examine the contents of the cabinet. At one table there were traces of chemical work, various measured heaps of some white salt being laid on glass saucers, as though for an experiment in which the unhappy man had been prevented. "That is the same drug that I was always bringing him," said Poole, and even as he spoke, the kettle with a startling noise boiled over. This brought them to the fireside, where the easy chair was drawn cosily up, and the tea things stood ready to the sitter's elbow, the very sugar in the cup. "Excuse me, sorry." There were several books on a shelf. One lay beside the tea things open, and Utterson was amazed to find it a copy of a pious work for which Jekyll had several times expressed a great esteem, annotated in his own hand with startling blasphemies. That's shocking, particularly for time period. So a pious work, so it's like a religious book, and a blasphemy is where you say things that, go against religion or go against God. So that's really shocking to find that in Jekyll's handwriting, there were all of these kind of anti-God, anti-religious things written all over a religious text. So again, another thing to question, what on earth is going on here? Next, in the course of their review of the chamber, the searchers came to the cheval glass, into whose depth they looked with an involuntary horror. But it was so turned as to show them nothing but the rosy glow playing on the roof, the fire sparkling in 100 repetitions along the glazed front of the presses, and their own pale and fearful countenances stooping to look in. "This glass has seen some strange things, sir," whispered Poole. "And surely none stranger than itself," echoed the lawyer in the same tone. For what did Jekyll... He caught himself up at the word with a start, and then conquering a weakness. "What could Jekyll want with it?" he said. "You may say that." So the cheval glass is a mirror. So he's like, why has he got a mirror in his laboratory? It doesn't make any sense. Next they turned to the business table. On the desk, among the neat array of papers, a large envelope was uppermost and bore in the doctor's hand the name of Mr. Utterson. The lawyer unsealed it, and several enclosures fell to the floor. The first was a will, drawn in the same eccentric terms as the one which he had returned 6 months before, to serve as a testament in case of death and as a deed of gift in case of disappearance. But in place of the name of Edward Hyde, the lawyer, with indescribable amazement, read the name of Gabriel John Utterson. He looked at Poole and then back at the papers, and last of all at the dead malefactor stretched upon the carpet. "My head goes round," he said. "He has been all these days in possession. He had no cause to like me. He must have raged to see himself displaced. And he's not destroyed the document." Okay, so Jekyll's will has been changed. He's now leaving everything to Utterson. And Utterson is perplexed because he's saying, surely Mr. Hyde would have been livid. Surely Mr. Hyde would have destroyed that document, because originally, of course, all of his money was going to him. Baffling. He caught the next paper. It was a brief note in the doctor's hand and dated at the top. "Oh, Paul," the lawyer cried. "He was alive and here this day. He cannot have been disposed of in so short a space. He must be still alive. He must have fled. And then why fled? And how? And in that case, can we venture to declare this suicide? Oh, we must be careful. I foresee that we may yet involve your master in some dire catastrophe." "Why don't you read it, sir?" asked Paul. "Because I fear," replied the lawyer solemnly. "God grant I have no cause for it." And with that, he brought the paper to his eye and read as follows. "My dear Utterson, when this shall fall into your hands, I shall have disappeared. Under what circumstances, I have not the penetration to foresee. But my instincts and all the circumstances of my nameless situation tell me that the end is sure and must be early. Go then and first read the narrative which Lanyon warned me he was to place in your hands. And if you care to hear more, turn to the confession of your unworthy and unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll." "There was a third enclosure?" asked Utterson. "Here, sir," said Poole, and gave into his hands a considerable packet, sealed in several places. The lawyer put it in his pocket. "I would say nothing of this paper. If your master has fled or is dead, we may at least save his reputation. It is now 10. I must go home and read these documents in quiet, but I shall be back before midnight, when we shall send for the police." They went out, locking the door of the theatre behind them, and Utterson, once more leaving the servants gathered about the fire in the hall, trudged back to his office to read the 2 narratives in which this mystery was now to be explained. Okay, weirdly, that's actually the end of the narrative. That's not to say it's the end of the book, because you've still got 2 chapters. The last one is very chunky, but the next 2 chapters are those narratives. So we leap into the letter that Dr. Lanyon wrote to Utterson and said, please don't open unless Jekyll disappears or dies. And then we've got Dr. Jekyll's statement of the case. So all of these mysteries, all of these questions are about to be answered. But in order to find out what those answers are, you've got to tune in to my next video. So if you haven't pressed subscribe, please do so, and come and find me again and read chapter 9 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Thank you so much for sticking with me. Happy reading and happy revising.